Good afternoon to all of you joining us today for our final session of this training. Thank you for being here. I'm Eloine Barry from African Media Agency. I'll be moderating this session today. Before I introduce our experts, just reminding you of a few housekeeping rules. So, pour our francophone journalists, pour nos amis francophones, vous avez une interprétation qui est disponible si vous cliquez en bas de votre écran. Vous avez un petit cercle et vous pouvez sélectionner votre langue. So this was for translation for our francophone journalists. There is interpretation on the line. So you can use this to select your language and follow through in your mother tongue. The second thing, you have been reminded of an invitation that we have for you to attend virtually the Africa FinTech Summit that is taking place tomorrow and Friday in Cape Town. And this is a complimentary invitation for you. We will place the link inside the chat in a moment if you want to register. I think it ties in nicely with everything that you've learned over the past 6 weeks. And I think it's a great way to participate and to listen into some panels. It's a truly Pan-African event. There are lots of startups taking part, lots of experts, and I think it would be great if you could participate, and they've been kind enough to give you free access. So in the interest of time, I'm very, very happy to have you, Michelle, joining us today. Thank you so much. So Michelle Shibunga, she's the founder and CEO of Global Policy House. She is a globally recognized blockchain, AI, digital transformation, investment and policy professional. She's also a senior government. She's advising quite a few governments, including the government of Bermuda, along with the African Union. She has been recognized as Digital Transformation Woman of the Year 2022, top 10 women in blockchain in Africa, and one of top 40 global FinTech for Good fellows. And this is linked with the United Nations. So she's heavily engaged in digital trade, e-commerce, anything related and most specifically, her geographies are emerging markets and Africa. She's often referred to as a young thought leader and investor in the blockchain finance space. She has been at the forefront of global blockchain and digital transformation projects. It is my pleasure to have you here today. Thank you so much. I think we're very lucky to have someone like you joining us and teaching this group of journalists. While we were preparing for this session, we share very similar values, Michelle and I. We are obsessed with our continent. We are obsessed with women. We're obsessed with using technology to solve some of our problems. And also we want to make sure that you journalists are equipped to tell our story. FinTech is our industry. So we hope that this session will give you more to dig in and to go out and to do the work of reporting. So this is it for me, Michelle. Your turn. We'll share your slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Eloine, and really pleasure to join everybody here today. I hope you can hear me okay. As Eloine said, this is a very exciting session for me personally as well, because of the very reasons she gave, especially around, supporting the continent. I think one of our common, passions is really very much supporting what is happening within the FinTech ecosystem, but more widely across the continent. For me, I see the continent, I'm Zambian, and I see the continent as the future. Certainly, I see people like ourselves, all of us here in this room today, certainly the future, the ones that are going to drive growth on the continent. So it's very exciting to be here, and thank you so much for having me. And I would delve straight into the topic. And for those of you, please do feel free to, ask your questions as we go along. I like it to be quite interactive. I mean, if we were doing this face to face, I would be asking people, questions as I go along. So do feel free to raise your hand and ask questions, and I'm sure those will be sent over to myself. But this week, you have very much been covering quite a lot and going into depth around what is actually happening with technology in Africa. And here we're going to focus a little bit more around regulation, and also just looking at how regulation technology, as we call it, plays a big part in particular in Africa, and how we can really start to drive growth through the fintech ecosystem and understanding the fintech ecosystem. But as I go along, I really want you, the journalists, to think of two things. The first is actually kind of what narrative is it that we currently have around the continent and also around the whole fintech ecosystem. Secondly, can that narrative change, or can we drive the narrative that is happening on the continent, especially when it comes to this new really booming industry around fintech on the continent. And I'll explain a bit more as we go along why I'm asking you to have that at the back of your mind as we're going through the presentation. So if we move to the next slide, I really want to kind of dwell down a little bit more, first and foremost, what we actually mean by regulation. So for me, it's not just so much about reg tech or regulation on its own, right? What we want is to be able to build what we call the Africa we want, right? And I'm sure most of you have heard about Agenda 2063 by the African Union and what we want to create on the African continent by bringing the African continent into one union and one family, if you like, right? And in order for us to do that, we have to all collectively work together to build on the Africa we want. And one of the areas we can do that is actually to start to leverage what is happening within the fintech ecosystem. And I have thrown in the edtech element as well, because I think that's quite critical, especially with everything that we're covering today. So, without the level of education and awareness around what is happening in this space, and what is happening around the whole regulation space, then we're going to miss a trick. So I have actually added to the module and added a few bits around the importance of education and how EdTech can play a role, just as RegTech and FinTech can play a role. But we'll delve into a little bit more around what we mean by each and every one of these areas. Next slide, please. So to begin with, I mean, we talk about, RegTech quite loosely. What does that actually mean? So regulation technology is what RegTech actually really stands for. And the main functions of RegTech is really looking at sort of regulatory monitoring, reporting, and compliance, making sure that we're compliant, we're following the right regulatory structures, and we have in place some regulatory framework to which we operate. Now, as most people know, the fintech ecosystem or the fintech industry is fairly new and hasn't really got a strong regulatory framework in many of the countries in Africa. We are still very much uncovering what that could look like, right? How can we regulate the whole the fintech ecosystem, and how can we ensure that we're compliant with what is actually required under regulatory frameworks? So one of the things that we want to try and focus quite heavily on is actually what sort of technologies can we actually leverage, right, within the fintech ecosystem to, in order to enable us to come up with very sound regulation, not regulation that's, sort of overbearing or stopping us from doing creative things, but regulation that's actually helped to provide some security and some safety and some safeguarding around what we're doing. So RegTech in short really talks about, those technologies that are linked to things like cloud computing, what we call distributed ledger technology, which is where you have things like blockchain sitting in. Now, I don't want people getting confused about DLT and all these, phrases you've heard, blockchain and all that. I think just park that at the moment. But what you need to know is you have a series of different technologies that you can use to implement regulation in a more innovative and efficient manner. Right. So when you hear things like software as a service, where there's lots of new companies that are coming in now, bringing in software as a service products and services, to help you with bringing technology that can help to introduce a more sound regulatory environment is what we're talking about under the umbrella of RegTech. And again, back to my earlier point, what is the benefits of all this? We want to make sure that we can, companies can be compliant. We want to make sure that we adhere to the regulatory structures that exist in the countries. And in some countries, to be fair, there isn't any regulatory structures at present. So it can be very, very challenging to understand actually what is innovative and what isn't. When we talk about EdTech, moving on from RegTech to EdTech. Now, EdTech really is more about technology solutions that we have in place, helping to, really make a difference within the education and awareness space. So again, when we're talking about, okay, today we're doing a course on, looking at regulation for journalism. So what we want to try and do is tailor that a little bit more so that we give you content that's more relevant for you. And we make it a bit more efficient in how you receive that content. So you don't have to necessarily be sitting in a classroom somewhere or sitting in a, a master classroom or something like that. You can literally take technology tools, your phone, your mobiles, that you spend a lot of time on, and you can self-learn. Using EdTech platforms and materials that we have coming. So that is going to become more and more of a stronger industry as we see things move forward. And we can raise awareness, and we can create content, we can create narrative, we can create stories using EdTech solutions as well. And the combination of EdTech as well as FinTech and RegTech elements are actually very critical for the continent, because we are still building a narrative, and we want that narrative to really be strong coming from the continent. I don't need to explain too much what FinTech is all about, but of course that's financial technology. And with financial technology, the provision is always looking at avenues for African economies to diversify using technology, right? And being creative around the financial ecosystem. So this is where you're seeing some of the bigger, FinTech players coming in Africa, and we'll delve a bit more down into what that actually means. So today we're going to focus heavily around the FinTech ecosystem. What does it mean, for the financial industry and other industries? And then how can the whole journalism aspect actually play a critical role? Where is your role within this new drive of FinTech on the continent? Moving forward, and please do feel free if you have a question, just to raise your hand as we go along. And moving on from the introduction, so next slide. I won't cover too much in this. So what is the state of FinTech, right? What is the state of FinTech in Africa? I'm sure many of you have heard about, oh yeah, Africa is really booming when it comes to FinTech, but what does that actually really mean? And where exactly is it actually really booming, right? So we've done kind of a bit of research, and we've checked out some of the reporting around what is happening with the FinTech in Africa. And then you can see here from the McKinsey report, that there has been a very big structural shift, if you like, that, at least 10% of transactions in Africa are digital, and FinTech solutions make up to 80%. Right, you make it 80% cheaper, and savings returns, up to 3 times higher, which is really, really significant. So you have this big shift where you're introducing new FinTech players coming in, but as a result of them coming in, they're bringing new products and services, which are very digitally led, and these solutions are starting to feature across many, many markets in Africa. But there are, of course, very few dominant markets in Africa that, we can say that FinTech is pretty prevalent. Just next slide. Again, here, it just gives you a bit of a summary in terms of looking at, is FinTech really playing a big part in terms of, is it an economic driver for the continent? It absolutely is. And you'll see in a minute a couple of statistics that really highlight that. Just to give an example, in the startup ecosystem in sub-Saharan Africa alone, there's been a growth of over 894% in funding opportunities that's going towards startup in sub-Saharan Africa, and most of those startups are FinTech startups that are actually really creating a lot of the growth. Now, the challenge we have, with the FinTech ecosystem in Africa is that it's dominated by a few players, right? And when I say a few players, I'm talking about a few countries where we're seeing a lot more activity versus others. So of course, in Africa, we have 54, 55 countries. But in terms of drilling down on the numbers and the figures, you find that actually, you only have up to about 4 or 5 countries in Africa that are really kind of driving the growth around the FinTech ecosystem. So you're looking at places like Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Egypt, and a couple of others who are really dominating what is happening within FinTech and that growth, as well as the funding is equally going into these markets, right? Into these few markets. Now, what we want to try and do is to make sure that we can, diversify a bit and really kind of reach all the other African markets to start to leverage the opportunities that FinTech can bring to those other markets that are not necessarily the big players at the moment. But certainly FinTech is being the big, innovative kid that's come on the block. And as innovative kids, of course, is bringing us new ways of interacting, new ways of doing payments, new ways of, doing trade, new ways of actually receiving money, new ways of saving money. And that is very, very exciting. So you have things like digital banking, you've got things like digital payments, you've got, and some of this stuff we have had previously in our countries. So like in Kenya, of course, they've always had M-Pesa as a driver, especially when it comes to, sort of peer-to-peer engagement and payments and things. So it's not necessarily new, but you're starting to do the scaling. You're starting to see scaling happening in these markets. But what we need to do is make sure that that scaling is also happening in other smaller markets in Africa. And the ultimate goal, of course, I think should be looking at financial inclusion and making sure that we also have digital inclusion. We hear a lot about financial inclusion, but we hear less about the digital inclusion, because not every single person in our communities is financially or digitally savvy. We have a lot of young people, of course, in our continent, but not everybody is digitally savvy, and we have to bring up people to a certain level so they are also able to interact with these new digital applications that are coming from the fintechs. I'm talking about our older populations that might be there, might not have necessarily be, savvy using the mobile phone. I'm talking about our rural communities. I'm talking about our informal sector, where we have 80% of Africa is informal sector, small, medium enterprises, women-led businesses, entrepreneurs. These are the categories of people we want to be utilizing these fintechs and benefiting from the applications coming from the fintech ecosystem. But are they ready? Do we have enough people who are aware and know how to use these applications, or indeed have access in terms of affordability of data or connectivity or anything like that? We have to make sure that we have that digital inclusion element considered on the continent. But of course, there has been a rise in terms of fintech companies. There's many fintech companies that are springing up across Africa. Predominantly, most of them are sitting in the payments realm, right? So, we're seeing a lot of people coming up with payment solutions. We're seeing kind of digital banking, solutions coming up to the market. And apart from payments as well, we need to think a little bit more around how can we grow other aspects. Now, smartphone adoption, what's kind of driving all this growth? What's driving all this growth in the fintech ecosystem is really, one, of course, smartphone adoption has risen. Even though, in terms of actual penetration, there's still quite low levels in some countries where not everybody is able to access data or connectivity, which is a big issue. So infrastructure, again, comes to the fore. It's very important that we look at, as there's more smartphone adoption, we're also making sure that we're not leaving some communities behind, and we're supporting others to take advantage of what's happening in fintech. And next slide. So, and then just some of the numbers, right? So I like to give people data, so some of the data and the figures really kind of tell us what the trajectory of what is happening within the ecosystem. So for me, I see it more of it's not necessarily just about disruption within the fintech ecosystem where we're bringing companies that are being disruptive, but it's actually a bit of a big monster almost kind of unraveling itself. Right. And there's more of like an eruption happening in the continent. And that eruption, like I said, is very much limited to a few countries here and then. We want to kind of even that out. But the eruption is real, and the eruption is happening at a very fast pace. Obviously, one of the drivers around this has been, with the onset of COVID and what's happening with COVID and people shifting into digital methods and digital applications. We're seeing more and more what I call the digitalization effect happening and coming into effect very, very strongly. We've been operating in the sort of digital space way before COVID. We've been looking and pushing very hard around, the importance of digitalization, from as far back as 2011. And to be honest with you, we did not get that much of a response in the earlier days before COVID. It's only when COVID hit, 2020 was the busiest year for our company because everybody literally just flanked over and said, okay, what the hell do we do now? We cannot connect, we cannot move, we cannot do anything. what is this digital stuff you've been talking about? How do we implement? How do we go about managing data? How do we know where we get our supplies for COVID, right? Most governments around the world were coming to us and saying, okay, what applications can we actually introduce so that we can get information and data, so that we can understand what we're doing around COVID and how we're managing COVID. So you have all of that around the digitalization shift. And then one of the other things that we need to think about, especially on the African context, is around the growth of e-commerce, which has been fueled by what happened with COVID. So we've had more and more players starting to engage, through e-commerce platforms. So how do we get more and more of the e-commerce sector, formalized and also supported with access to capital? That is very important because, again, e-commerce is going to play a very big part. The internet economy in Africa is predicted. There was a Google IFC report, which pretty much said the internet economy is worth up to 180 billion, will be worth up to 180 billion, in Africa by 2025. But how many of our young people, entrepreneurs, our business, our SMEs are fully leveraging what they can do in the e-commerce and fintech ecosystem? We can say not that many are fully yet, but they should be, because we know that what's coming, right? We have the potential to really create more access to GDP for our countries by leveraging what is happening in fintech. But in order for young people to be able to leverage that, and our entrepreneurs and SMEs to leverage that, they have to understand what is actually there for them to use to get into the e-commerce market, to play a big part in the e-commerce market, in the internet economy, and in the digital economy. What are the benefits of that? Of course, the benefits around, creating more jobs, supporting, these predictions that we can up to 3 million jobs by 2025, which is huge if we really tap on the e-commerce market and support the e-commerce market in Africa. And so this eruption, which I'm describing, or the next couple of slides, really talking about the eruption of fintech, but also the eruption in terms of the potential that we have with this industry. And then why is it important on the journalism side? Because we need the journalists to be able to actually raise awareness and education about what we can actually unravel, especially when you're going to entrepreneurs and SMEs, women-led businesses. This is an area where they can come in and actually have a significant part to play. Most of the consumption that is done, especially take fashion, for example, or, hair, makeup industry, most of it is dominated by women who are the consumers, right? But what we are saying is that we want to be able to have these women and SMEs and businesses to actually be the creators of the next digital platforms or applications where they are selling their products and services, and helping to actually support growth that they are part of. They're not just consumers, but they're also producers, and they're creating new products and services, which is very, very important and can play a part in taking advantage of what's in that internet economy I talked about. Next slide. And I'll pause a little bit in case people have questions, because I can see there's a couple of questions coming in. But if you do have questions, I'm sure the team is fueling that in, and we'll pick up in a minute. But next slide, please.
Okay. Michelle, there is a question. So I'm moving on to next slide. There's a question from Google who's saying, hi, Michelle, FinTech is transforming financial landscape and providing new opportunities. Can FinTech regulation enable African countries to achieve digital inclusion without disrupting the new industry?
Fantastic. No, it's a fantastic question, and we'll actually address it in the next 2 or 3 slides, I believe. But I'll leave that one and keep that one in mind for when we talk about regulation, fintech regulation. But certainly, there's some pointers around that, and I think the fintech regulation has a big part to play in driving inclusion, but we are going to cover it in the next couple of slides. So just looking at the next slide. So this again is just giving you an overview of the type of activity happening within fintech. So it's not just about payments. I know payments is a big part, and one of the core parts that we're seeing fintech providers actually fill the gap. So to payments across the continent, so you're seeing more and more fintech players coming to resolve the pain points that we have around payments. But what we saw as well during COVID and post-COVID is we are starting to see the usage of things like drones, the usage of artificial intelligence to read data and support access to data and information. We're seeing the whole rise in blockchain, which is in my world, you know, the usage of blockchain and what we call DLT technologies, right, to help with looking at transparency and supply chain and that sort of stuff, which I will cover a bit later on. 3D printing, again, you know, helped a lot during COVID. So when you're looking at sort of printing all sorts of different equipment, you know, people were turning into 3D printing, which is another different technology offering. And next slide, please. So you can see that, you know, when you talk about fintech, when most people think about fintech in Africa, they immediately think in just payments, but it's actually beyond payments. We're seeing more and more companies actually go into the other areas apart from payments. So the eruption continues. And here I wanted to give you guys just a little bit of key statistics that tells you that this is not just something that is happening in small, you know, in small amounts, but it's actually beginning to be a very big monster that is growing. The question is, that monster sustainable, right? That is the key question. But we are seeing the numbers and the data is really telling us that there's a big trend happening here. You know, $207 billion raised from 534 fintech exits globally in 2021 is a huge amount. 1.5 billion worth of funding in fintech in 2021, which is risen, you know, by 894%. Is a huge amount, right, in sub-Saharan Africa. And that is just a total of 128 fintechs. So you can imagine if we double that amount of fintechs, right, what is the level of funding that we're likely to get in the next 5 years or so? You know, what is going to happen when we kind of double the number of fintechs? And hopefully that doubling of that number of fintechs, you're also doubling the offering that is coming from the fintechs. So we're not just focused on payments, but we're focusing and trickle down into other areas that has value, that can bring value. And the rest of the numbers are pretty much saying the same thing, where we're seeing a lot of growth, fintech revenues going up 8x, you know, predicted to reach 30 billion by 2025. So you can see really we are heading towards what we call the eruption within the fintech ecosystem, but we need to move that into other areas as well. The e-payments market, again, projected to grow by a huge amount, 40 billion by 2025. So again, all this data is really just explaining to you what is the makeup of the fintech ecosystem and what is the potential. Now, as journalists, I really love for you guys to help us in telling the story and focusing the lens, right, on the African market, to say actually what is happening on the African market, but what is also the potential. You know, one of the important areas that is not covered very well is actually highlighting what is the potential. And that's telling of the story from an African journalist perspective is really key. Because what we want to try and, you know, showcase the investors from who we work with, you know, I'm in the investment side, and we're trying to get investors to be interested, to pay attention, including internally driven investors in Africa, to say, here's where you can get some value out of, you know, by investing into these markets. Here's how we can grow value. And this is how we can support economic development in our countries. If you can put your money down in value-adding activity. And the value-adding activity, by the way, is not necessarily just fintech. The value-adding activities, when you're investing in manufacturing, you're investing in agriculture, you're investing in, you know, these critical sectors, which, by the way, these critical sectors are going to be heavily reliant on the products and services that are coming from the fintech ecosystem. So that's how to kind of think about it and how to, you know, we've got so much amount of funding coming to our journalists. You need to just think about how we can be clever and creative in our reporting. Next slide, please. Yeah, and so the next couple of slides, again, you know, we're asking the question, is fintech then an economic driver? Certainly from my point of view, I think we've had this slide already. I think from my point of view, certainly, you know, fintech is going to be a big economic driver, but it can only be a very value-add economic driver if it ties into the other areas that we're talking about. So I'm talking about the whole agriculture. I'm talking about manufacturing. I'm talking about, you know, moving beyond just payments and starting to support the other areas of growth is very, very important. Shifting from this slide, and I'll take one more. I think there's another question here. Which country is home to Africa's largest fintech ecosystem? and how big is fintech market in Africa. So the fintech market in Africa, I think I have some stats somewhere in this slide, but Nigeria is one of the largest fintech ecosystems, as you can imagine. One, of course, the population numbers there add quite a lot, but also in terms of actual drivers in certain areas of fintech, Nigeria is playing a big part. And then Kenya is another one. So Kenya, for example, when it comes to things like, agents on the ground who are helping with kind of mobile money type activity, Kenya is very, very dominant in that. Nigeria is very dominant on the fintech ecosystem side of things. And the market itself is very, very huge. I think I have the stats somewhere here. And just moving, I don't know if we're stuck with the slides, but the next one what I wanted to cover was very much looking at how we can support how the fintech companies themselves are spread around. I mean, this yes covers the funding, amount of figures and numbers that have gone into funding fintech, which I don't need to repeat. You can look at this. This is just data for you guys to look at, to actually see that the dominant markets, as I said, were these kind of 4 or 5 markets. Nigeria, Egypt, of course, Kenya, South Africa. Nigeria is a big one and Kenya is the big ones. So this is how you can see kind of it's not evenly spread. So the rest of the map, as you're seeing there, we need to start to see more activity there. We need to drive better investments to go into some of these other markets. And sometimes there's some really good fintech products happening in these markets that you don't see here, but you don't hear about it, or it's not reported because, it's not coming from the big 4 or 5 that I referred to. So it's very important, I think, in terms of reporting. If Zambia has something pretty, special that it has to offer, we need to report on that. If one of the Francophone countries, has something that is coming up but we don't hear about it, we need to report about it, right? Just because they're not in the big 5 or 4, it shouldn't be a case where we don't hear about it, because that is also good practice for the other countries in Africa to know what is happening. So I think that again is where we can see the media really playing a big part. And moving forward to the next slide. Yeah, so back to the question on regulation. I hope we can bring that question back on, because I think this really addresses what you were asking, whether, fintech regulation in Africa can support inclusion. Yeah, in my point of view, yes, to a degree, regulation can support inclusion, but it also can hinder the opportunities to actually drive inclusion, depending on how your regulatory structures are formed. And how your regulatory environment, is. So for me, when we're talking about regulation, what exactly do we mean by regulation? What are we regulating? Why are we regulating it? And how are we regulating it? Is very, very important, right? So if we're talking about fintech, do we understand the fintech ecosystem as regulators, number one, or do we not? And if we understand the regulatory system, what is it out of those elements that we need to regulate, or we need to look at regulating? At the moment, regulators are definitely working together to try and uncover, what that looks like, especially in the fintech ecosystem, because it's fairly new, market, right? And so it's not like a traditional banking environment, which you've had for centuries and centuries and for many years, and you know how to deal with that. This industry is fairly new, and this industry is evolving very, very fast. So again, for regulators, it can be quite difficult to kind of keep pace with what's actually happening within the fintech ecosystem, and to know what are the differences with, I don't know, cryptocurrency, decentralized finance, digital assets versus a traditional payments innovation that's happening. Where do you bag all this, right? Because they're all slightly different things. So it's a complicated, dynamic, new environment in which the regulators are grappling with. So, we are sometimes a little bit tough, I think, on regulators to say, oh, you haven't come up with regulation, or you've come up with regulation that doesn't fit. But remember, this is a new industry, and we're still seeing what is happening within the industry. So automatically, we have to spend a bit of time trying to understand what it is, and we need to collaborate. We need to work together. Regulators need to be able to interact with one another to come up with more sound regulation. What are you regulating? Do you understand what you're regulating? And once you begin to understand what you're regulating, then you can come up with the appropriate levels of regulation, and also start to engage with the community that can help you to formulate regulation. So we're starting to see more and more of that happening. where you have the regulators are engaging with governments and also players within the fintech ecosystem. And they're starting to have the conversations around how can we actually design regulation. In Africa, what I am seeing is, of course, more and more regulators starting to ask the question, actually, what do these industries mean for us in our countries? And how can we actually get more involved in supporting regulation so it actually enables financial inclusion and it enables the levels of inclusion. Some countries are slower than others. Others are a little bit more advanced in terms of having that discussion and conversation. And that will continue to vary, depending on the response rate that we're getting from regulators. But one of the great things that we are, seeing is, especially in the payments ecosystem, again, back to payments, I'm sure you've heard of PAPS, the payments, a settlement system by Afreximbank, where they are trying to actually make a unified payments system that makes it a little bit easier for payments to happen on the continent. And this is a collaborative project, that Afreximbank is driving to try and get the central banks, the banks and others to come together to work at providing a Pan-African payments ecosystem. That makes it easier for payments to happen. And of course, the governance around this will be very, very important moving forward. The regulation around something like this would also be very, very important. That is something that is still ongoing and still being discussed. At Pan-African level, I am sitting on the African Union, the CFTA Secretariat, the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, where we are going to be looking at new rules and protocols and, that cover legislation around some of these areas like digital trade, like fintech, like emerging technologies. How do we want to start to approach these new world of fintech and this new world of digital assets, right? How can we regulate them? Should we regulate them? Do we know what we're actually regulating? So there's a lot of discussion and work that's being done to actually explore how we can start to look at regulation very, very carefully. But it is absolutely fundamental, I think, that we have very robust regulatory structures in place in the continent. And you notice that if you move to the next slide, you notice that in some parts of the world, in many parts of the world, there might not necessarily have very clear regulation of what's actually happening. It could be around things like data laws, right? Do we have data laws in our countries? Do we have any regulation around data protection or not? And most of the countries, for example, in Africa, I think there's quite a few countries in Africa, we just don't have any laws at all, but there are others who also have very clear rules and laws that they want to introduce or have introduced around the usage of data and the flow of data. And that is where we need to get to, but we also need to share the practice and the information to say if Kenya has done well, or Swaziland, a smaller country, Eswatini, or, wherever, right, Zimbabwe, has come up with something that is kind of working for that country, we share the practice. It doesn't mean we're going to take it exactly as it is, because our economies are very, very different. Our cultures are very different. The way we respond is very, very different. So you have to be careful in terms of making it a bit more tailored and how you design your regulatory structures. But we also need a harmonized overall, what I'll call like a guidebook, right? That kind of provides at least a foundational elements that need to be considered when you're building your regulatory structures. And that is what we are working at the African Union level. So this is more of a guide, but at national level, it is up to the governments and the regulators and the players in those countries to actually come and formulate regulations that's fit for purpose. And what are the challenges? So I thought I'd kind of map out a little bit more around the challenges around regulation, but also regulation technology. Because this plays a very significant part now when it comes to regulations. So can we use technology to regulate? And if we can use technology to regulate, in the earlier question that was asked. So how do we go about looking at or tackling the barriers that exist around regulation technology, which is RegTech? And obviously there's limited implementation. So there are solutions around the world already, really good RegTech solutions around the world, but most of people don't know about it, or they're not implemented widely or in full scale. So again, how do we make sure that we can change that and we have scalability? And through scalability, we can also transform. And then the wider spread of more and more regulated RegTech operators or companies that specialized in supporting more RegTech solutions to come to market is very important. Of course, there are barriers to adoption of some of these RegTech solutions because people are either don't understand them or are not aware about them, not really sure, should we be adopting this or implementing this in our organizations or in our country? So there are barriers around things like, barriers to entry, which includes also in some countries, less so in Africa, but in other parts of the world where they're struggling to implement certain technologies because of the legacy technology they have existing. Now, in Africa, we can leapfrog. We're already doing it. We've been leapfrogging. And again, another reason why FinTech has really expanded is that we've had the chance to leapfrog, and we're leapfrogging, be it we're using our mobiles, we're not sitting and waiting for landlines or whatever it is. And but going ahead, we're doing business on our mobiles, we're doing business on our, our applications. So we can see that leapfrog effects taking place, and we have less of a challenge around the legacy based technology applications. But there's also the issue we have to be frank around, maybe from the regulatory side or regulator side, where there is a bit of a reluctance to promote newer technologies, right? Or RegTech solutions. And for me, that's partly because, there's a little bit of a poor understanding on where these technologies actually apply and a full understanding of the benefits of the technologies. I'll give an example, right? So when we talk about blockchain technologies, often when I mention kind of blockchain around the world, it doesn't matter where, I often get sometimes, people saying to me, oh yeah, Bitcoin, I don't care. I'm not sure about that. I don't want nothing to do with that because it's all about fraud and people are going to scam me and everything. But that's actually very a narrow view of looking at it, because actually, even though Bitcoin and cryptocurrency comes from the family of blockchain, the underlying technology itself can do so much more. Right, it's beyond just the cryptocurrency or the Bitcoin element. It can do a lot more around supply chain, around transparency, around tackling fraud, around tackling corruption. The technology, the mother underlying technology has so much more that it can do for our economies, for our businesses, for our banks, for our small, medium enterprises, right? There's so much application that can come from this technology, but because it's so poorly understood, and because what you hear about in the media, right, back to media and back to reporting, what you hear about is more about the valuations, how much crypto has gone up, how much crypto has gone down, how many people have lost millions, how many exchanges have gone bust. This is what the reporting is, right? There's less of the reporting in terms of like, oh, do you know that, blockchain technology can actually literally take you from X and save 30% efficiency saving, right? It can be so transparent across the supply chain. Like when we had COVID, if we had a blockchain system enabled, we will be able to know like where the PPEs that I need, where the masks that I need, who has supplies, who doesn't, how fast can I get it, in real time. This is the benefits of some of these technologies, but it's so poorly understood and so poorly reported on that we don't really get to hear that side of things. Next slide, please. And I have 10 questions. Elaine, please go ahead as we load up the slides. Yeah, so we've kind of got to the break moments as well, which is perfect. So we're halfway through kind of like the lesson at the moment. And one of the things I like to do is, like I said, is to have a bit of an interaction from people who are on the course as well. So, for me, I had also posed some questions just to get your feel of what we've discussed so far. And my kind of questions back to the audience is very much around, just this overview we had around FinTech in Africa and getting your viewpoints around, do you think FinTech can enable inclusive growth in Africa, which is pretty much the same question I got from somebody who had posted the question earlier on. So do you think it's going to enable inclusive growth based on what you've heard, based on what we've discussed? And is the growth in FinTech funding sustainable in Africa? So those are the two things I want us to just pause for a little bit and maybe start to address. And I will also, start to look at the questions that we have posed as well. So I'm going to open this back out to everybody. I don't know if anybody has wants to put their hands up and wants to talk a little bit more around these two questions, given what we've discussed so far.
Michelle, your connection is a little in and out. Do you want to try to switch off your camera so we get a better audio?
Yes, let me do that, because once I do the camera off, it's actually. Can you hear me better now?
We can hear you. I think we can hear you well. So we do have questions in the chat if you want to take them now. We have a follow-up question from the original one from Gugu that says, how could regulation deal with fintech integrity risks such as identity theft, online extortion, and ransomware attack? What about inappropriate commercial use of disclosure of consumer data by fintechs? I don't know if this is something that you want to address now or later on.
Yes, I can address it later on, but it also picks up a little bit on what we've discussed. And I think one of the ways that regulation can play a part in that is that I think if you have very clear regulatory frameworks in place, right, it's going to help with limiting a lot of the fraud that we have going on, number one, because everything is a little bit more transparent. And then, of course, you know, you're going to be able to make sure that with those solutions, the fintech solutions that I'm talking about, most of them are also looking into the whole cyber-proof application. So when it comes to cyber identity and problem with ransomware, which is what the question is about, we can actually use the technology applications that are being developed to minimize cyber attacks, for example, right? And to protect data, which is back to extortion, is also you can use these technologies to protect information and data so that it's locked. It's more difficult for hackers and people like that to come in, you know, in terms of helping to, you know, to disrupt, right? And look, especially around identity theft, which I think was mentioned. You know, most of identity theft looks at data and open data that is there. So how can we protect that? And that is back to data protection, which I will talk a little bit about later on. But certainly these technologies that are there and some of the solutions that are coming up that are being developed by fintechs is actually addressing some of this issue around protections, you know, and protections around ransomware is actually quite important as well.
Thank you. We have, I will just speak to Atsa quickly in French. Atsa, je traduis votre question et je la prends tout de suite, d'accord? Then we have another question from Jariatu, who's saying, please, how does African, okay, I think it's, how does Africa stand if the implementation process is limited on fintech? How can Africa break these adoption barriers?
Yeah, so if from what I understood on that question is how to, if implementation or access is limited, what impact would that be on Africa? I think, yeah, how does Africa stand if the implementation process is limited? I think if the implementation process is limited, I feel we're going to miss out as a continent. So I do feel strongly that I think the time is now for African economies to leverage what is happening, yes, in fintech, but overall in what is happening in the fourth industrial revolution. So the fourth industrial revolution is being driven by technology, basically. Right. And if we do not take advantage of what's happening in that revolution by, you know, getting in touch with what's happening with fintech and starting to play a role in developing fintech solutions and not just consuming the fintech solutions that are on the table, but developing and taking part and then bringing that and implementing that is very, very important, right? And if we are limited by certain barriers, this is where we've been pushing very hard to say, actually, these are the barriers that are limiting us to fully participate in the fourth industrial revolution in the fintech ecosystem. Let's try and sort it out. And some of these barriers are things like access to data, access to, you know, connectivity, you know, infrastructure. These are the things that might limit us to fully take advantage, but that is not stopping us, as you've seen from the numbers. It's still not stopping us because we're going ahead anyway and trying to leapfrog right where we can in countries, and fintech players are doing their best to actually produce the products even within environments where there's limitations. So I think if we don't fully take advantage of the implementation process, we are going to miss out on something that we can easily, I think, you know, kind of really take advantage of, and that can help our economies grow.
Thanks, Michelle. And we have a question from Atsa. That's I'm sorry. Regulation requires rules of conduct in fintech. Do you think only the states should take these steps, or should this regulation be put in place by more than the states and like other actors?
Yeah, no, 100%. I think this is down to more than just the states. So it cannot be left to just governments or regulators. I think when it comes to the whole development of regulation and the implementation, right? So one of the things that we have about that I have to emphasize on regulation is that we can come up with frameworks, really good frameworks. But if those frameworks cannot be enforceable, then there's a problem. And if we have players, just one actor that's actually coming and creating these regulations or regulatory frameworks, is going to defeat the purpose. Because as a regulator, like I said in the beginning, as a regulator, you might not necessarily understand the industry in which you're going to go and regulate or try to regulate. Right. So the important thing is to be able to consult and work with the players, including private, the private sector, and the fintechs and the banking ecosystem. So you take a more ecosystem approach to it and make sure you're consulting with the right players to actually understand, first and foremost, how do we regulate so that it's also implementable. So when we bring regulation or legislation or whatever it is into force, it can actually be delivered. And that regulation can also be embraced by the private sector. So it's certainly not up to just the states. I think this is something that should be done across the board with other players.
MSN from Zimbabwe is asking, how has fintech impacted diaspora remittances? Michelle? I think we lost Michelle. Michelle, can you hear? Okay, I apologize for this. Let me check. She was having little connection issues, so let me check on her.
Yeah, it's a fantastic
Okay. Michelle, I don't know if you can hear me, but you're...
So I think, yeah, where remittances actually... Can you hear me?
Okay, now you're back. So do you mind starting again, because you were off for about 45 seconds?
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Yeah, go ahead.
Fantastic. I just got thrown out there, but that's technology.
Yeah.
But I was saying, yeah, no, definitely remittance question is very, very important one and a great one, because remittances is where I think we're going to see the next big shift on how we deal with remittances and cross-border payments. And I think, fintech is definitely helping to make it a little bit more cost effective when we're dealing with remittances. So instead of paying high levels of margins to get money, shifted from country A to country B, and me sending money home to my mom, to my sister through, companies like Western Union, we're seeing actually quite a few fintechs coming into to reduce the cost of me doing that. And that's where, again, fintech is playing a big part. And I think, remittances is like it's such a big industry, and we're losing quite a lot of money in just fees in remittances, whereas you bring in the fintechs and you bring in a fintech solution around remittances, and we're cutting that the fees by more than 80%. right? So you can imagine the transformation around that, because it's going to become more and more affordable to actually send money, but it's also more and more affordable to send money from Africa back to other parts of the world. And that is an interesting model, because we haven't seen that happening before. But I believe there is a company already doing this, where they're making it easier to send money from Nigeria into UK or wherever else. And that's what's happening, right? So the whole business model is being toppled, especially when it comes to remittances, and it's becoming a lot more cost effective around remittances as well.
Which is great news for us outside of the continent. We have a question from a Francophone journalist, and I think it is an important question as we look at all the different aspects of fintech and what it really means. So the question is from Koué Bonaventure. Is online banking the same as fintech?
No, online banking is not necessarily the same as fintech, but it can be a form of fintech offering, depending how that is designed. So online banking is just you being able to do your banking services online. Whereas a fintech offering could have a lot more than just you being able to do your banking online. It could be able to enable you to make payments, peer-to-peer payments, and to have other applications added onto it. So it's a bit more of an offering than just an online version. And then again, on a fintech product, you might be able to do things in real time, and be able to do transactions real time, exchange data or value in real time, which I think is slightly different as well when you're thinking about online banking. So online banking is where you're doing your normal banking services online. Whereas a fintech product, might have a lot more applications added to that, if that makes sense.
And I think we can take one last question for the moment. Can you share with us some of the bottlenecks that has hindered the growth of fintech in Africa? That's a question from Elom.
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll cover this a bit more as well for part 2 of the lesson. But some of the bottlenecks that has hindered fintech is actually also things I referred to earlier, like access to data and information. It has really limited scalability, right? So access, clear regulation and rules about how you're operating in certain markets, again, has hindered certain fintechs to grow and to expand, because if there's no clarity around regulation, clarity around compliance, it makes it very difficult for these fintechs to go into those markets to operate. So again, that's been a bit of a barrier. Access to finance and investments is another barrier that I know about, especially when it comes to women-led businesses who are trying to run their fintechs. Some of them are trying to get more money so they can sell their business, their fintech business or whatever it is, and they're finding it difficult to raise capital. So these come of the softer barriers that I think we could definitely change. And then, of course, access to connectivity and infrastructure, again, something I talked about earlier on, that is also limiting opportunity to scale what we have going on the continent. It's certainly not a case of lacking talent. We have a lot of talent on the continent, but the disadvantage as well around talent is that most of that talent is being scooped up by international organizations who are able to pay them much better. Who are able to retain them much better than we are in Africa. So again, it's about talent. And one of the barriers is actually how do we retain talent so that we can grow our operations. So those are just some of the few, barriers that are limiting the fintech growth, I suppose, in Africa.
I said it was the last one, but sorry, I just realized there was another one in the chat that might be relevant to what we're talking about now before we move on. It's from Ashek Yakub Hassan, who's saying that, considering the different rate of fintech penetration in each of the African countries, is it possible to consider a common regulation? Sorry, I'm translating from French. Is it a possibility to have a common regulation for like a pan-African one?
Yeah, it is possible, but I think, again, like I said earlier on, and this is something that's being already looked at African Union level, where we want to create some standards, right? So we want to create some some standards and almost guidelines around what should constitute a good regulatory structure, for example, regardless of what market or country you're in Africa. But we still need to look at national level because, like I explained, what's happening in Zambia, in Lusaka, and what's happening in Nairobi, what's happening in Lagos, what's happening in Eswatini is going to be much slightly different because of our economic makeup. So again, you have to be quite tailored at national level. So you might have, overarching high-level standards and guidelines that we have in place, which, can be Pan-African level, and you have the basic. And that is actually being created already under, for example, the CFTA, where we are literally at the moment, I'm part of the team that is looking at the digital trade protocol. And that we're, kind of thinking about, okay, what does the digital trade protocol, what should it involve? What sort of legislation should look like? How will it impact the industries and stuff like that at Pan-African level? But beyond that, it's up to now the national economies and national countries to start to think about, okay, what legislation might be helpful to my fintechs or might be helpful to my businesses so that I can be able to operate and to scale. So when we get to that level, it's important that you also look at it at a national level, even though it would be good to have, some sort of guidelines, Pan-African guidelines that help to steer what happens at national level.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you. We'll carry on with the questions later on. Do you want to carry on with the slides and move on to the next section?
Yes, definitely. So thanks to those who have given feedback on the questions, and do feel free to keep them coming online, and we can pick that up a bit later on. But if we move to the next slide, so this is part 2 of the lesson, and what I want to cover in here, is getting a little bit more, I suppose, a bit more technical, but at the same time, it's also addressing, in a bit more nitty-gritty what is happening on the continent, or areas that we need to focus on, right, moving forward. So when we talk about, I've mentioned some of these already, the importance of connectivity, importance of regulation, the importance of consumer protection, and how we're driving this is very, very important, because if you don't have, somebody asked about cyber and protections, if we don't have cyber security at the heart of it, if we don't protect data and we look at data, then we're going to be missing the trick, especially around what happens in the fintech ecosystem. We have to think about intellectual property, right? And IP. How do we protect IP? How do we protect those, fintechs that we have on the ground in Africa who are doing really well, who are scaling very well? And how do we protect their IP so that they're not losing their IP, or people are not coming, or external agencies and groups are coming to buy up these fintechs, and we're losing the IP internally in Africa. Is very important that we can have some level of protection. Then, of course, privacy is a big discussion. So, a lot of people say to me, I think somebody asked a question around how do we protect consumer protection? What about data? And how to protect people's data when we're talking about, the usage of data and information, especially in designing these fintech products and services. So privacy is very, very important within the digital economy. And the digital economy currently is very much being run by some of the big techs of the world, right? And these big techs hold a lot of our data. Yeah, so I want everybody in this room to remember that your data is sitting somewhere with some of the big techs, because I'm sure many of you are all kind of Facebook, you're on, I don't know, WhatsApp, you're on these social media platforms, we all do it, you're LinkedIn, you're here, that is your information, that is your data. Now, how much of you, how many people here know that, that data sometimes being utilized to actually market and monetize and get money through your data from other platforms? Not many people think about that. You just enjoy the fact that you can message your friend on WhatsApp, and you can message your friend on Facebook, and you can share your pictures on Facebook. So there's quite a lot of that happening, but at the end of it, it's actually a business, and there's a lot of money that's being generated through that activity from some of the big tech. So we have to think about how can we actually protect our information and data to the level that even you yourself as a journalist, if you decide, no, you know what, you hold my information, I would like to sell the information to you rather than you just having it free and you're monetizing and benefiting from it. So how can we protect, how can we inform is very, very important. But we also want an environment, or a digital environment, or fintech environment, where we have a competitive environment. So it's not just one big player that is dominating the markets. We have others that are coming in. All this combined together is going to help with scaling, right? And it's going to help with what we call interoperability. So we can start to interoperate and work together, right? To make sure that these systems are almost in harmony when they are operating. So when you have these ingredients together, you're going to have a very nice soup at the end, or a very nice dish, whatever you have, your nice pepper stew or whatever it is, because you've got all these ingredients. But in order for us to get to these ingredients, we have to do quite a little bit of work here and there. And we have to do a bit of the education, awareness raising, the reporting, so that some of these people, especially the fintechs and upcoming new businesses, are aware that one, either they are protected, the investors that are coming in know that there's consumer protection, the regulators know that, okay, I'm happy there's regulation that's happening, right? The market is operating in a reasonable manner. Investment money is there in order for us to scale and grow what we have going on. And of course, we're protecting around data and everything else. Moving to the next slide, please. And so privacy, again, I've talked a little bit about privacy. I think privacy is very, very important, especially in terms of financial institutions and how they protect the data. So again, banks and big institutions hold a lot of our data and our information. So how are they going about protecting that information, right? And making sure that we have ways to manage data is very, very important moving forward. And then what are the, what are the, if there's no compliance of the regulation that comes up that have been implemented, how do we go and enforce, right? How do you make sure that you can get compensation if your data is misused, for example? If there's no standardized approach, there's no compatible systems, there's no, sufficient information to manage all that process. It makes it very, very difficult, right, to manage. So privacy, how do we protect? How do we ensure that there's a level of privacy for the information that a lot of the tech groups hold is very important. Moving forward. Next slide, please. And to be honest, I mean, one of the things that can be done is actually making sure that we can utilize technology to do those protections I'm talking about. So now you have new emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, like machine learning, like blockchain, like big data solutions that can help on the privacy and making sure your data is not misused, making sure that you yourself have control of your information in your data. So even the fintechs that we're talking about, they want your data. They want your information. They want you as customers. What do you understand, kind of what they are asking from you? Because most of the times, I don't know, those of you who've gone shopping and now you get companies asking you, please, instead of me giving you a physical receipt, I want you to give me your email address. That is data collection, right? That is for them to be able to market to you much easier. But you can protect that, right? You can say, okay, no, I'm not necessarily going to give you my email. If I give you my email, what are you giving me in return? So these sort of things we need to do. And the artificial intelligence basically uses technology to read and manage what is happening with your data and your information and tracks that, if that makes sense. So it's very, very important, I think, to look at how we manage data and how we can improve data collecting methodologies without abusing privacy. And moving forward. And this slide, again, I have gone a little bit deep into privacy because I think it's very important. And most people around the world, including the fintechs, the governments, regulators, everybody's very concerned about privacy. So a lot of the innovations you're starting to see coming, the concern is very much, how do we ensure there's a certain high level degree of privacy that is happening? And you can see here just a simple map of just outlining in other parts of the world what people are doing around privacy, right? Making sure that there's some sort of protections in place around privacy is something we're looking at. Now in Africa, there's, again, like I mentioned, I think about 20 countries have data protection laws or some sort of data rules in place. Now we need to get that across the continent of the 54, 55 countries where we're clear about data usage. We're clear about how these fintechs are using information and how the existing big techs are using information, and we're protecting the information. we also have to think about how do we hold the data that we own in Africa. Most of the data actually flows out of Africa, and we have, data centers sitting in, other parts of the world that's actually holding African data. So how do we support and protect that and move that is very, very important. And why is data so important? Data is very important when it comes to formulating regulation. It's very important for regulators to be informed so they come up with the right regulation, right? Data is important for governments to be informed about what's happening with their citizens. Data is important for fintechs in the private sector because it allows you to design products that actually make sense for your target market. So data is pretty much everything, and that's why you find companies care more about getting your data, even more than getting your money. Because they know that they'll get that money back if they have data in the first place. So data is actually more of a commodity, right? It's more of a commodity than is, the cash itself, if that's making sense. Next slide. And so here, yeah, I've talked about this already. I think where we're saying blockchain or cybersecurity applications are really, really critical for, for the deployment of regulatory structures and for the development and management of crises, be it around cyber attacks, we've talked about a little bit, blockchain or, kind of DLT, what we call DLT-based currency. Again, this is things like digital currency, right? And programmable money. It is a new ways of which, central banks and banks are looking at how to innovate around money. And that can be very, very important for Africa because obviously we have had issues around currency fluctuations. The Naira today is worth this and tomorrow is going to be worth something else. And you move from country to country and our currencies are very destabilized. So again, there are new methods of, you can utilize technology to actually bring a bit of stability in the currency markets. And of course, it provides opportunity for job creations as well. And it also helps in terms of looking at strong governance structures, and providing, information around how you actually look at governing and what governance actually means as well. And so for us, I think these technologies, when you're starting to think about governance structures within these different ecosystems, it's also important to think about how can we leverage tech, right? How can we in the same tech ecosystem have very strong governance structures? Right, and forget the last line around proof of stake and DLT. So these are more technical terms that we use to describe what type of methodology is used to create blockchain solutions. And those methods and what methods you use will determine things like how much energy you're using, sustainability, and that type of stuff. So we need to think about governance structures even when we're operating with certain technologies. Apology, I'm going to move slightly because it seems to be a little bit noise background from my end. So if you give me 2 minutes to just move,
Okay.
I shall be back.
Yeah, thank you. Just waiting for Michelle to find the right spot. Thanks for your patience. I think you can enjoy the break to stretch your legs.
Yeah, I thought it's much better find somewhere a little bit quieter.
Yeah.
Because there's quite a lot of feedback from my end anyway. But thank you so much. So I was saying, I mean, to just wrap up this particular slide here, in case people didn't hear me earlier on. So one of the areas, I mean, we're using obviously technology, but even within technology, what I was saying is that you can actually create new governance methodologies using technologies. These same technologies I'm describing can actually help to create more transparency and better governance. So, you know, where you can have virtual a governance team to vote on things and vote on rights. And then on the security end as well, you know, on the cybersecurity end, you can utilize things like a blockchain and AI, for example, to protect data, to manage data so that data is not freely accessible, right? And it's difficult to get into these data sources with things like blockchain and AI, cyber protecting it basically. So it makes it more difficult, but if you have technologies, it can help with actually protections. And it also can help with providing better governance structures as well. Next slide. Yeah, and now on the inclusion bit. So this is back to our question earlier, because I know a lot of people were asking quite a lot around inclusion. You know, how does this actually drive inclusion? How does this actually lead to sustainable measures? And for us, you know, especially for us as a company, it's very important on the inclusion and the impact part. You know, so these technologies, great to have, you know, wonderful technologies, right? It's great to have fintech products and services that are being developed. But if those products and services are not making impact, are not helping to transform, right, and provide access and inclusion to all communities, then it makes it very, very difficult to even scale those, because at the end of the day, we want transformational change. And so for us, fintech provides an avenue. I would say an avenue or a catalyst to actually enable more financial inclusion, but it also enables more digital inclusion, like I said earlier on. So by the fact that we have now payment solutions in place that basically anybody can use using your mobile phone, your smart phone, you're able to manage your payments from A to B, including in the rural areas where you're able to send money to your mom or wherever she might be in this village versus that village, then that is quite transformational and it's inclusive. But at the same time, we don't want to cause high levels of, not having inclusion in some areas, because either those people don't have access to mobile phones, or those people don't have cannot afford to have data, or cannot connect one way or the other. So we're actually causing a digital divide. So we are trying to tackle that and make sure that, okay, if we bring in fintech solutions, or we bring solutions that are powered by these technologies, how do we make them inclusive? How do we make sure that everybody can actually reach these solutions? We've got a huge farming and agriculture markets in Africa. You know, so how can we support, for example, the farmers? in Africa. Can some of these technologies play a part? Yes, they can play a part. Yes, it's already happening, where farmers now can use basically even just their mobile phone to read patterns of weather patterns, what's going to happen with their crops, taking a picture of their crop and being informed through the technology of what is wrong with their crop, right? And how they can actually improve their production cycles. It is quite transformational and game-changing. So again, we're starting to use technologies in clever ways that are a little bit more sustainable and can provide better access and opportunities, which makes a lot of sense. And so the whole issue around can FinTech, can RegTech, and can EdTech, remember the three, the FinTech, EdTech, and RegTech, can they play a part in inclusion? Absolutely, yes. Can they play a part in terms, is it sustainable? Absolutely, yes. Because, by bringing those three together and providing the access and the data and the information, we're actually heading towards sustainability. And so you can see how, and blockchain, I put it right center there, because blockchain can play a part in all those areas. And I'm sure most people don't really understand or know that blockchain can actually play a part in terms of connectivity, right? And providing all these players I've talked about, they can be in one chain, basically, where they're able to interact and do business with a lot more transparency, and also with the ability to know what's actually happening from point A to point B in real time, which again makes a very big difference. And then the data is locked onto the system where the data is secure, which is also very important. Next slide, please. So, and kind of to just pick up again, why do we care so much about inclusion and sustainability? What does it matter? I think it matters because as a continent, we need to be able, I think, moving forward, to be able to sustain ourselves and be able to actually drive solutions that's going to drive growth on the continent, but it's also going to drive inclusion. And when we have inclusion, that means that everybody's participating, everybody has access, everybody has opportunity to be transformational in this new world of digital, in this new world of FinTech. And if we have strong regulatory infrastructures and strong regulatory systems, then we are bringing in inclusion, back to answer that question. But at the same time, we are also heading towards sustainability. Why do we want to be sustainable? We want to digitize, yes. We want to be able to, leverage the tools we have. And this is a fantastic opportunity now because we have the fourth industrial revolution, like I discussed. Nothing is stopping us. So we're not relying on, currency from the US. We're not relying on this from another country. Literally, it's up to us. We've got a blank page and we can digitize. We have a new policy framework coming into force with the CFTA. The Continental Free Trade Area, which is bringing Africa into one single market. So it provides us a unique opportunity to actually drive inclusion. And also not just drive inclusion, but drive growth and drive competitiveness for our continent and for the continent to be able to leverage these tools so that we are, back to my earlier comment when I started the presentation around how we want to create the Africa we want. And we want to sit within the Agenda 2063, which is to deliver an African market that provides for Africans by Africans. That is very, very important. And I think FinTech, is one avenue to do that. It's not the only avenue, like I've described, but it certainly is going to be a big player in terms of helping to, to get to the growth that we want a little bit faster and a bit more efficient and innovative way. Next slide. And so for us, again, as a company, we focus heavily on actually designing what this regulatory framework actually looks like. And today, obviously, we don't have much time to go into the detail of what that framework really is, but we certainly have been working with many players, including the African Union, the banks, the regulators, central banks, and people like that to think about, how do we design this framework and what does this framework mean? So for us, we refer to it as the RTF, which is a regulation transformation framework for the African continent. And that is really, being driven by a network of African players and leaders. And for us as a company that's heavily focused around regulation and policy as well as tech, we are really pushing for this very hard because we feel that if we have this framework in place, this is for the whole continent, then we're able to start from somewhere to create our standards, to create our rules that are driven internally from Africa and not necessarily, you know, kind of coming from outside. Because it's important, I think, back to sustainability. In order for us to sustain this, we have to be able to create the narrative. And of course, the journalist world and the journalism environment is critical to create this narrative. So when we have the framework kind of coming out, it's up to the journalists to be able to communicate you know, this framework so that across Africa, people are familiar that we have some sort of standards and we have some approach, you know, when it comes to things like regulation, especially in such a critical value add sector like FinTech, as we've seen. How can we grow that FinTech ecosystem? How can we protect? How can we provide an environment where it's safe for people to interact with all the digital tools I talked about, and they are, you know, well informed on how to interact with these digital tools? I think that regulation framework is very, very important to achieve that. Next slide. And so in terms of what the future looks like, so these are kind of more the, you know, summarizing points that I wanted to make as we move forward. Right. I mean, obviously, 2 hours is really definitely not enough when we're covering the topics that we have covered, and we've tried to mash up quite a lot in the presentation. But one of the important things is, you know, we communicate a lot. We talk a lot. We all go to conferences. We all host conferences. We do a lot of the discussions and the dialogues. But for us, I think it's very important now, especially now for Africa to act. You know, so what are the actions? What do we actually need to move forward with, you know, in terms of what I'm calling FinTech futures, right? So what are the FinTech futures? How can we actually grow we know that it's a value add area. We know that it's growing across Africa. Yes, we have some things we need to work on, like making sure the rest of the other countries are participating in the digital economy and in the FinTech world. But what else needs to happen? I think in terms of, you know, talking about policymakers and decision makers must be able to build a very robust regulatory infrastructure and regulatory framework that is fit for purpose for Africa. I think is very important. And that structure has to be data-led, like I've explained. You know, without data and without being able, you might have a lot of data, which we do in African countries. We all have a lot of paper-based information and data. We need to digitize that. We need to be able to use that data to give us information about how we formulate our regulations and how we support the structures that we want moving forward. We have a young population. You know, I keep referring back to the population and the demographics, because that is also a resource that a lot of other parts of the world do not have. So we have a young population. We've got women-led businesses, you know, we've got small, medium enterprises doing incredible things. We've got the informal sector. Nobody's really captured, you know, what is happening in the informal sector and the amount of GDP that comes from the informal sector in Africa. We can help to strengthen that. And I think the FinTechs, particularly, are playing a very big part to help support more and more small, medium enterprises, right? So we need to capitalize on that, and we need to skill up those industries. When I say skill up, we need them to be able to understand how to leverage the digital tools I talked about, how to participate in creating new digital applications. We're seeing that in e-commerce. We're seeing that in new apps that are being built by young Africans. You know, Nigeria, take for example, is #2 in the world in terms of cryptocurrency adoption, right? It's #2 when it comes to building new, you know, data applications as well. So we have the talent on the ground. We need to nurture that talent, invest in it, reskill it, and make sure we can retain it, because we have companies like Amazon and others coming in and really scooping up that talent, which again is a bit of a disadvantage to Africa in terms of sustainability, because we're losing talent, we're not creating and maintaining the IP I talked about in the continent. So we need to be able to invest in that. And then, of course, we need, like I've talked about, education, you know, having an Africa-wide education and awareness program. This is really critical. And this is where I think in journalism that we need a lot of your help, because, you know, we in the industries are aware of what is, you know, what is valuable and what is potentially huge for Africa. But we are not able to communicate that because we're too busy doing our business and building our products and, you know, bringing in the tech and the regulation and all that. But somebody has to talk about it. Somebody has to communicate in a language that is actually favorable to Africa. So it's very important, I think, here where we bring in the journalists like yourself to help us do that, to raise awareness and to support with the education drive that we have. Capacity building is important, especially with our regulators, with our governments, to understand this sector much better, right? So we need to be able to do a lot more around educating and supporting even the governments and the regulators to understand how to deal with this new world of digital. And then, of course, regulatory financing packages are needed. More investments is needed to create these structures for all the countries across Africa, because not all countries are well equipped with financing to help, for example, I don't know, to create new frameworks and things. All that kind of costs money. So we need to have some investments around it. And then, of course, challenging the, tackling the challenges we talked about earlier on. So is it the barriers to entry, affordable data, connectivity, understanding the digital innovations that we have, right? How can we actually help with that? Creating a continent-wide global platform is important, right? Can we look at actually creating our own global, when I say global, I mean, continent-wide platform in Africa that people can go to, and get some sort of answers on a lot of these things is quite critical. And next slide. Yeah, and finally, we kind of had this video as well that we wanted to showcase. If you can manage to click on it, Eloine, I don't know, but it's literally just a 3-minute video, which has very summarizes quite a lot of stuff that we've talked about, and what is the direction moving forward. So here we have a very prominent, the head of the CFTA, really kind of outlining what the future kind of looks like, especially when it comes to things like FinTech and digital assets. And why it's so important for us to invest in this area. I hope we can get the video going. And I've also put on the side there the map to just showcase how rich Africa is in terms of commodities, but also to just emphasize it's not so much about just the commodities, it's about the talent you have, it's about the opportunities for tech. Actually, tech can operate in all these countries, in all these areas. Tech can be the glue, basically, that helps to connect all of this, if you like. I don't know if you've managed with the video, Eloine, but we can get
I don't know if you can see it. Let me know. Can you see it, Michelle?
I can't see it yet, no. I don't know if the others can. I think it's coming up.
Yeah.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to address this summit on a very important topic, investing in Africa with digital assets. This summit comes at a critical time when we are implementing the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has the potential to accelerate industrialization, particularly digital industrialization in Africa, and to transform our economies. The focus of this summit on driving investments to key sectors such as agriculture, healthcare, energy, entrepreneurial spirit is important for the continent's sustainable growth and is aligned to the vision and the objectives of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is also critical that we leverage the opportunities that the digital economy and digital trade present to the African continent. I'm pleased to inform you that as one of the pillars of the AFCFTA, the heads of states and government of the African Union have directed that we negotiate a protocol on digital trade, which will include a range of digital economy related aspects, such as payments, data transfer, etc. This protocol on digital trade will enable the continent of Africa to be competitive in electronic commerce and to ensure that the African continent is forward-looking and is part of the digital economy. I emphasize the need for us to work together to support interoperable and inclusive payment systems that will enable Africa to thrive and to do so in the context of the protocol on digital trade. Partnerships are critical for us to deliver on the AFCFTA, and ensuring that we open the trading corridors for African businesses, particularly for small, medium enterprises and for young entrepreneurs. A very exciting development that I have been informed of is the imminent launch of the groundbreaking Women in Trade, in Digital Trade initiative to be launched by the Global Policy House during this summit. It is a commendable and much needed initiative to mainstream women in critical sectors of the economy, including digital trade, emerging tech areas such as blockchain, which are key and will shape the future of Africa's digital economy. I want to thank you once again for inviting me and for convening this important session, and I look forward to our collaboration. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't know if everybody was able to see it. From my screen, it was blank, but at least you could hear it. I don't know if it was the same for you, Elaine.
I could see it. I think there was a bit of a technical glitch. I think JB told me the same. It was black on their side. You'll have it inside the slides.
Yeah, and you can watch it at your convenience, because I think the link is there anyway for people who might want to watch it a little bit later on. But that was His Excellency Wamkele Mene, who is Secretary General for the African Continental Free Trade Area. And as I mentioned, we are working on the protocols that he talked about in the video, so which will really have an impact around fintech, digital assets, you know, and what happens right in future in terms of regulation and legislation that might fall out of these protocols that we are working on at the moment. So his messaging, I think, was very clear around how we need to leverage the digital economy. We need to look at fintech and support growth within the fintech ecosystem and support, you know, sort of data and clarity around regulation in Africa, but also clarity around the messaging and the partnerships that we have, which again is where we go back to the media and to journalism, where we need to work much closer with African journalists, you know, who can actually support in terms of giving that messaging and translating what is happening in this space. If we move to the next a couple of slides, I know we'll have a little bit of time at the end for question and answer as well. Yeah, so before we kind of go into the question and answer session, I think just to summarize based on what I've covered, I know I've covered quite a lot of detail, you know, over the last hour and a half or so. But I think some of the critical, clear messaging around the topic we're discussing is that, yes, number one, fintech is playing a big part in Africa, and we can see some of the dominant markets, which is like 4 or 5 players. So for me, that gives me the excitement to think, okay, we have 4 or 5 players on the continent, but we have 54 countries, 55 countries, right, in Africa. So what can happen with those others, right? If we can start to share the information, if we can start to help to educate our young people, our entrepreneurs, and our businesses, even in the other countries, to take advantage of what's happening in fintech. Secondly, yes, the fintech ecosystem is growing, but there's also some issues that we need to deal with, which includes very poor, you know, clear regulations is not there everywhere. We're not quite there, especially in new areas such as cryptocurrency and blockchain. There isn't any regulation that is there at the moment, and we're starting to see that being addressed. You know, now South Africa has just introduced, has mentioned, you know, and communicated to the world that they're going to be treating things like crypto and Bitcoin and stuff like that to be regulated under, you know, like normal financial products and things. Obviously, we have different views around, you know, what that actually really means, because digital assets are slightly different from normal financial products. So again, we have to think about what are the implications of that. But at least some countries are starting to look to address the regulatory aspects of things. And again, to summarize, obviously, we need to think about how we protect information and data, and not just information and data, but also people. You know, at the end of the day, who are the players in fintech, but who are also the consumers of these products? You know, so we need to be able to protect and make sure that what is being released to the market and to the people is safe, is secure, and is robust. And then we need to also have our regulators and our governments to come to a certain same page, as even the fintech, to understand how to regulate and work with the fintechs and other players to create regulation that can be implemented on the ground is very, very important. We have to talk about, you know, think about the policy implications and you know, what are the policy impacts of us introducing certain regulation? Yeah, how is it going to affect the people of Africa? And when I say the people of Africa, it means everybody in Africa, those in the rural areas, those in the you know, urban areas, the young people, you know, those without access to internet, those without this, all that has to be taken into consideration as we move forward. And finally, I think for me, you know, as a closing, it's really important that we take advantage of the fourth industrial revolution. FinTech is an avenue, but there's so many other areas for IR that we need to look at and to support so that we can grow the African continent. I can tell you, I'm pretty much, I've been around the world because I've been doing this since like 2011 or something. And I've been around the world, right, and worked with regulators around the world, including I just came back from Bermuda. Bermuda is a very small country, right, you know, in the middle of an island somewhere. But it's a small country, but very, very powerful when it comes to things like regulation and insurance, right? And they have really pretty much kind of designed already a regulatory framework around how they want to manage digital assets in Bermuda, and also how they can export that knowledge across the world. I've been involved in the Bermuda side of things, you know, for 5 years and helping them to design and actually create that regulatory framework. And we need to kind of similar, we're doing the same obviously with the African Union, the CFTA now, but we need to be very, very careful that we are designing things that are fit for purpose for the African market and they're not a copy and paste, even though we can have lessons and best practice that we can get from all these other countries. When it comes to things like, it's not just about payments in fintech, I think we have to diversify a bit more. We have to look at currency. We have to look at how we innovate around our own currency and strengthen our currencies. And we are covering all sorts of things around digital currency and trying to work with the central banks across Africa to really look at how we can innovate around this space. So Africa is a lot more independent. We want to look at reducing levels of debt in Africa. We want to stop being strangled by debt issues that we've had for a very long time and to help the continent become a lot more competitive. And I think that's the summary for my end. But just to sort of close off, I know at the end we said we're going to leave some time for some more question and answer. And I have also kind of, just to summarize the lesson, I also want to get a bit of a feel from everybody what they think after we've had the discussions we've had, what you think on some of these questions as well. So Eloine, I'll hand over to you. I don't know how you want to handle it. Either we take questions first that have come up, and then we might also be able to answer other questions that might be there. But my contact details are all here. You know, the background to what we do is all here. You can connect with us. We do summits as well. You're all invited to the summits and things. And I believe Amal is going to have more and more of these classes and things, and we can pick up from there as well. But we can go back to the question and answer in case people want to answer the questions we have, or I can address any questions that are remaining. Or if people want to put their hand up, it'd be great to hear your voices as well.
All the choices. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you. Thank you. So yes, we do have a few questions in the chat. As Michelle was saying, if you feel like asking your questions live, please raise your hand, and my colleague JB can let you can open up your microphone and allow you to speak. So Gugu is asking you, I hope those, or maybe it's a comment, Michelle, I hope those digital trade protocols will encourage fair competition between fintechs and traditional banks, because governments favor traditional banks for their integrity and stability that financial institutions has created.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So if this gives you any encouragement, we are a small fintech company, so we're certainly not necessarily pushing for the big players. What we are saying on the digital trade protocol is actually this has to be super inclusive. And remember that our continent is full of small, medium enterprises and not necessarily the big players. So I have made that personally, actually made that a very same comment you were saying, that we do not need to look just necessarily as supporting the big players. We have to bring everybody onto the table, and we have to cater for everybody, especially the small, medium enterprises, because that is what our continent is actually made up of. And of course, for me as a small business as well, it's very important for us that our voices are heard, the fintechs are heard. You know, we are a fintech, we are building our own blockchain products, and those products are designed to actually cater for the African market. So for us, it's like, okay, how are you going to support us? We're African talent, we're African diaspora. You know, how are you going to support us, right? And it's not so much about the big players alone. Of course, we have to make sure that the big banks as well as the fintechs are operating and are starting to also have a relationship. And we're saying basically, if we design those digital trade protocols, it caters for everybody. But with a particular focus on small, medium enterprises, because that's what the continent is actually made up of.
Elom de Seu, so he said that earlier and I sort of left it there, and I think it's probably a right time to pick up this question. He's saying, don't you think stiff regulations have kept deterring most SMEs to venture into e-commerce?
Yes, no. Like I said earlier on, you know, regulation is not about just regulating for the sake of regulation. The regulation can also be a hinder, can also be a problem, can actually cause more problems sometimes if you get it wrong. So for me, it's very important that I'd rather you take your time to understand what it is that you want to regulate, right? And really have a full understanding of it, to bring in some regulation that protects and actually helps to get innovation going. That's how regulation should be and should not be hindering. And what we've seen in some places, like you've rightly identified, is that that's created problems and people have switched into on the alternative means, right? Even the stuff I was talking about around digital assets, blockchain, you know, cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, a lot of people have shifted into those markets because they're not able to get the support they need from traditional environments, or because in those traditional environments there's very difficult and very rigid regulation, right? So that is what we need to clean up a little bit. I think where there's regulation, where it's creating problems, we have to be honest about it, even with our regulators, to say, no, this is not working, this is not implementable, this is causing a problem for us. But that has to be communicated, and we have to find ways around how we can improve that. But there's no point just sitting and saying, okay, we're just not going to have any regulation at all, because then that causes other problems, as we know, right? At the same time, if you bring in, you know, overly heavy regulation just for the sake of regulating, it creates more problem and you're losing out. The point to really remember is you are losing out on the GDP that you will be getting if you have these innovative businesses in your countries. And this is the messaging I am giving to central banks, regulators around across Africa. And I'm saying, look, if you really want to create GDP, you want to revive the economies after COVID, and you want to have value-adding, you know, sectors doing well, and you want to leverage technologies, you have to look at the regulatory structures, and you have to consult with people who are in these environments, because they know a little bit more than you do when it comes to these economies, and then you can work together to create some proper regulation.
Thanks, Michelle. We have a question from a Francophone journalist called Komi Mawuligada, asking, do fintechs represent or present opportunities for commercial banks?
Absolutely, 100%. But I can tell you honestly that I feel like the commercial banks are not leveraging that fully at all. And I think that's where we're missing the trick. So I was in Taiwan. I was invited to Taiwan by the government in Taiwan. And what I saw there in terms of the interaction between the fintechs and the banks was pretty incredible. And this was 2019, right? Just before COVID hit. I'm pretty convinced I probably had COVID from when I was traveling, because I felt a bit ill. But you know, what I saw there was actually, you almost kind of don't know that there's a fintech that's kind of providing the solution, right? Because you have a bank, because the banks are pretty dominant, right? And they're big players. But what they've done is they've gone and partnered with fintechs to bring in particular solutions which are presented to the customer. So the customer doesn't really know that, oh, I'm dealing with a global policy house fintech. No, I'm getting a really good service, and you know, I can send my money easily. It costs me less, you know, and the banks are partnered with the fintech, but me as a consumer or end user, I don't really know that. All I'm getting is a good service, right? All I'm getting is efficiency. All I'm getting is I'm spending less money on things. But then the bank and the fintechs have come to a partnership to say, okay, you provide us the innovation, we provide you access to customer base, you know, so you have those solutions coming together. Whereas I think currently still on the continent, I'm seeing some banks are starting to be a little bit more open and starting to engage a bit with the fintechs, but there's still not that strong relationship where we're saying to each other, what are you good at? What am I good at? Let's come together and let's provide, you know, for the end user, let's provide a service or a product that actually is going to make a difference. So I think for me, I would like to see a lot more of that relationship happening between the two, because you can actually get quite a lot of value out of it. You know, and then it's going to help the economies as well, right? The more and more we can get these two operating and working together, the more we can scale faster, the more we can reach more customers, the more we can innovate even better. And for the banks as well, banks I feel a little bit too slow when it comes to innovation and actually missing out by not being so interactive with the fintechs.
And a follow-up question from Still Komi. Why do you think that in some country, in a few countries, well, it's I would translate it literally by Congress, doesn't vote regulations or is hesitant to vote them?
Yeah, I think partly because, I mean, I might be wrong, right? I think it's partly back to the whole understanding and awareness of what's actually happening in those areas. So, you know, even within sort of Congress, who are the people that are looking at these legislation, right? How much knowledge or awareness or opportunity to understand the sectors we're talking about, how much of that do they have? So it's going to be a bit slow. And then, of course, politically wise, there's a lot of political you know, sort of hurdles that we all have to go through, you know, when you, especially, you know, kind of back in Africa, we all go through some political limitations, right? You know, for example, if a legislation is being passed one government and then the government changes and blah, 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 you have all those challenges as well that you have. But I think that's why it's quite exciting that we have now at African Union level, you know, at CFTA level, where, you know, we're starting to actually create for the whole continent, right? We're starting to look and say, actually, as a minimum, as a basis, what are the elements that are needed to create a strong regulatory ecosystem? What about things like dispute resolution systems we have on the continent to help with managing our own disputes, right? We're not going to, I don't know, Paris or London, or wherever else, to even manage our own disputes, right? We're looking at things like that, which I think are going to be pretty game-changing for the continent. We're looking at our own trading ecosystem, you know, multilateral trading ecosystem, and not necessarily just relying on, or, you know, let's just wait to hear what everybody else is doing around the WTO. You know, there's all sorts of discussions around trade, for example. How do we want to manage trade in Africa? How do we want to spur intra-regional trade across Africa? What are the rules that we need to look at? How do we drive investments from our own capital markets? How do we grow our capital markets so that they can service Africa? Because the interest is always going to be more for Africa, right? If it's internally driven, and it's a lot more sustainable as well, right? We're not sitting and waiting for external investment groups to drive our growth. We are doing that ourselves by building into the capital markets, by supporting. And of course, technology, guys, is just an enabler, right? Tech will help to get these things going. Tech will help to move from A to B. And tech also relies on the human element to tell you what it is that you want to do, right? So the technology itself is not going to come and help you generate more GDP or help you to connect with this and that. Is the human element that comes in and designs technologies or products and services that will get us from A to B, because we are the ones that are familiar with the problems we have, you know.
Thank you, Michelle. And I think we'll take one last question from Gugu. should digital inclusion and financial inclusion through fintechs be driven by governments or markets, or should all stakeholders be involved? I feel we sort of answered that, but there's a second side to the question. Is it light regulation an option for fintechs because they are already operating, and therefore regulation should safeguard safety and other important compliance?
Yeah, I think it should. It really depends. I wouldn't say yes, 100%. Let's just go for light regulation, because what does light regulation mean? I think we have to go for the appropriate levels of regulation, depending on what it is that we're looking to regulate. So if we're saying, you know, we have a buoyant cryptocurrency or Bitcoin market, for example, in Nigeria, right? We can't just say or pretend that that market doesn't exist, and we just say to all the players, sorry, you can't interact with cryptocurrency or Bitcoin. But yet we have, I don't know, you know, half of the youth population really interacting with that market and generating GDP. So how do we regulate that? It doesn't mean we need light regulation. It just might mean to say, okay, we regulate all the exchanges that are dealing with these regulations. So I think we have to be a bit more tailored in approach. We can't say we just need live regulation for fintechs. I think even within the fintech ecosystem, you find that even as fintechs, we are also calling for regulation, right? Because it also gives us credibility, especially credibility when we start to operate beyond just our borders. So beyond just Africa, when I'm starting to do my stuff in the US, in the UK, in Bermuda, you know, I'm going to be a lot more respected if I come from a regulatory structure where, you know, there's confidence that, you know, we have been through the regulations and we're also compliant. Is very important. So for me, it's about the right levels of regulation. It doesn't mean it's light or heavy regulation. No, it has to be appropriate for what it is that we are regulating in the first place.
Well, fantastic. This marks the end of our session. Michelle, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, having such an expert on board, you know, really is heartwarming. And I know that there was lots of questions. I'm sure that everybody learned quite a bit today. I certainly have. We look forward to having you again, possibly very soon, and to work on more projects together. As you know, as we understand it, as Michelle highlighted, the critical part and the critical thing in our economic development is how we are reporting on all the industries and all the work that is being done, and how we really craft a homegrown narrative. And this is, you guys have the most important job to do. So we're here to support, we're here to equip you. Please go out, write. If you have any questions, send them to us. I'm sure Michelle will be happy to address some of your questions, but the idea is to really see this in action, see this knowledge being applied in your writing, and to change the course of our narrative, doing it ourselves and building the Africa we want, really. So thank you all so much.
Yeah, and Eloine, I think just a quick thank you from me to yourself. You know how much I'm supporting this and how excited I am to support this. So please do feel free to reach out anytime, and everybody who's on the call, do feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help. Any questions, further questions you have, more than happy to help. I think it's up to us. Like I said, I'm sure you can tell I'm a Pan-African. So, you know, I'm big on trying to get the continent moving. And I think we have all the right tools and all the right people, actually, the young people, you know, to actually drive what's going to happen on the continent. So I'm very, very excited. And it's been an honor to provide this lecture. So thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. We thank EcoBank, also our sponsor, for this training. You have a beautiful end of day. Happy deadlines, everybody. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you so much. Take care. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.